The story begins with a moment that caught millions of viewers completely off guard. Late one evening during her broadcast, Rachel Maddow appeared on screen with a tone that many longtime viewers immediately recognized. It was the tone she uses when something unusual is about to be revealed. And what she said next instantly sent shockwaves through political circles across the United States. Because according to Maddow, there were growing signs that Donald Trump may have been quietly preparing a strategy that very few people inside Washington fully understood. But the most surprising part wasn't just the claim itself, it was the evidence she began walking through piece by piece. At first, the segment looked like a routine political analysis, a few headlines, some recent statements, a recap of recent events. But then something changed. Maddow pulled up a timeline, and that timeline revealed a pattern that many viewers had never noticed before. Several key political moves, scattered across weeks and months, suddenly began to look connected. And when those pieces were placed together, they appeared to form something far bigger than a normal campaign strategy. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. Because according to Maddow's investigation, this pattern suggested that a much larger political plan might already be quietly unfolding behind the scenes, a plan that could dramatically reshape the next phase of American politics. Now, to understand why this revelation caught so many people by surprise, we have to rewind the story a little. Over the past several years, Trump has remained one of the most influential and controversial figures in American politics. Supporters view him as a disruptive force willing to challenge the political establishment. Critics, on the other hand, argue that his political strategies often rely on unpredictability and shock. But whether people support him or oppose him, one thing has remained clear. Trump has always been very strategic about timing. Major announcements, political rallies, legal responses, campaign messaging. Many of these moments have followed patterns that analysts only recognize after the fact. And this is exactly what Maddow claims she had uncovered, a pattern that may reveal something much bigger. During the broadcast, she began pointing to several seemingly unrelated developments, a sudden shift in messaging, unexpected political alliances, and a series of statements that at the time appeared vague or even confusing. But when those statements were placed side by side, they seemed to reveal something else entirely: intent. And this is where things started getting even more interesting. Because Maddow suggested that these moves could be part of a coordinated strategy designed to reshape the political battlefield long before the next major election cycle. In other words, the plan may not be about winning one moment, it may be about controlling the entire narrative. And if that interpretation is correct, the implications could be enormous. Political strategists often talk about the importance of framing the battlefield. Who controls the conversation? Who sets the agenda? And who forces the other side to react instead of lead? According to Maddow's analysis, Trump may already be attempting exactly that. But the details she revealed raised even more questions, because some of the moves she highlighted didn't look like normal campaign tactics. They looked like positioning that could influence legal battles, media coverage, and political momentum all at the same time. And this is where the investigation took an even more surprising turn, because Maddow then pointed to a development that had received very little attention in the national media. At first glance, it looked minor, almost insignificant. But when she connected it to the larger pattern, it suddenly became one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. And what happened next stunned many viewers watching the broadcast, because that single detail appeared to reveal the possible objective behind the entire strategy. Not just influencing headlines, not just energizing supporters, but potentially reshaping the political environment in a way that few analysts had predicted. And if that interpretation is correct, the consequences could extend far beyond one political campaign. They could influence how power is negotiated inside Washington itself. But before we look at what this alleged plan might actually involve, there's one critical detail that makes the entire situation even more complicated. A detail that many viewers completely missed during the original broadcast. And once you notice it, the entire story starts to look very different. But before we look deeper into what this alleged strategy might actually involve, we need to understand why Maddow believed the pattern was so significant. Because according to her analysis, this wasn't just about campaign messaging, it was about timing. And timing, in politics, is everything. During the broadcast, Rachel Maddow began highlighting several developments that had unfolded almost simultaneously. Legal developments, media narratives, political statements. Individually, each event seemed routine, but when placed together, the sequence suddenly started to look coordinated. And this is where things took a dramatic turn, because Maddow suggested that the real objective might not be what most observers initially assumed. Instead, the goal could be something far more strategic, something designed to shape the political battlefield months, even years in advance. According to the theory she outlined, Donald Trump may be attempting to engineer a political environment where every major development strengthens his position regardless of the outcome. Think about that for a moment. Winning the narrative no matter what happens. It sounds almost impossible, But Maddow argued that several recent events suddenly make that possibility look much more plausible. And this is where the investigation became even more intense, because she then introduced a concept that political strategists often discuss behind closed doors: controlled chaos. The idea that by creating a constant stream of dramatic moments, controversies, and headlines, a political figure can dominate the national conversation. When that happens, opponents are forced to react instead of lead, and when opponents react, they often play directly into the strategy itself. But that wasn't even the most shocking part, because Maddow then pointed to a series of political signals that may reveal the deeper objective behind the entire strategy, signals that many viewers had completely overlooked. One of those signals involved messaging that appeared to shift dramatically over a very short period of time. At first, it seemed inconsistent, even contradictory, but Maddow suggested that the shifts might actually be deliberate, a way of testing which narratives gain the most traction with voters. And once those narratives are identified, they can be amplified at precisely the right moment. But that raises an even bigger question. What exactly is the final objective? According to the theory Maddow outlined, the strategy may involve three key phases. First, dominate the national conversation. Second, frame every major political event as part of a larger conflict. And third, position yourself as the central figure in that conflict. If that sounds dramatic, that's because it is. Political storytelling has always been powerful, but in the age of social media, cable news, and nonstop digital coverage, controlling the narrative can become one of the most powerful political tools imaginable. And this is where things became even more fascinating, because Maddow then highlighted something that very few analysts had been discussing publicly: a series of political reactions that appeared to follow Trump's messaging almost immediately. Some supporters echoed the talking points, critics responding with outrage, media outlets rushed to cover the controversy, and within hours the story dominated national headlines. But according to Maddow, this reaction cycle may actually be part of the strategy itself, because once a story reaches that level of attention, it becomes nearly impossible for other political topics to compete for the spotlight. In other words, the conversation stays exactly where the strategy wants it to stay, centered on one figure, one narrative, one ongoing political drama. But just when viewers thought the analysis couldn't get any more surprising, Maddow revealed one final detail that made the entire situation even more intriguing, a detail hidden in plain sight, something that had been publicly visible for weeks, yet almost no one had connected it to the bigger picture.
And once that detail was added to the timeline, the entire strategy suddenly appeared far more deliberate than many analysts had realized. Because it suggested that the plan might not just be about influencing voters. It could also be about influencing institutions, political institutions, media institutions, even legal institutions. If that interpretation is correct, the implications could be enormous. Because strategies like this don't just shape elections, they shape the entire political environment surrounding those elections. But here's the twist that made Maddow's analysis so controversial. Some experts watching the broadcast immediately pushed back. They argued that the pattern might simply be coincidence. After all, politics is full of chaotic developments. Not every sequence of events is part of a grand strategy. Yet others disagreed strongly. They argued that ignoring patterns like this could mean overlooking the real dynamics shaping modern political power. And that debate is still unfolding right now. But before we get to the reactions pouring in from across the political spectrum, there's one final piece of the puzzle that makes this entire story even more unexpected. A small detail that many viewers completely missed during the original broadcast. And once you see it, you may start looking at the entire situation in a completely different way. As Maddow's analysis spread across social media, reactions began pouring in almost immediately. Supporters of Donald Trump dismissed the segment as political speculation. Some commentators argued that the timeline Maddow presented was simply a collection of unrelated events stitched together to create a dramatic narrative. But critics saw something very different. They believed the pattern Maddow described might actually reveal a deeper political strategy that had been hiding in plain sight. And this is where the story became even more intense, because within hours of the broadcast, political analysts across Washington began debating the same question. Was this really a calculated plan? Or was it simply the unpredictable nature of modern politics playing out in real time? But while that debate was unfolding, something else happened that many viewers didn't immediately notice. And this is where the twist begins. Because buried within the original segment was a detail that only a handful of political observers caught during the first viewing. A small moment, a brief reference. But once people went back and reviewed the broadcast, it suddenly stood out. During her analysis, Rachel Maddow briefly mentioned a sequence of upcoming political events that could dramatically shape the next stage of the political battle. Legal hearings, major campaign rallies, and several key announcements expected from influential political figures. Individually, each event looked routine, but together they formed something far more significant, a political timeline. And if Maddow's interpretation is correct, that timeline may reveal when the next phase of this strategy could begin.
Because timing, as every experienced political strategist knows, can determine everything. The right message delivered at the right moment can shift public attention overnight. It can dominate headlines, it can control the narrative, and it can force opponents into reactive positions. That's why many analysts believe the real story might not be what has already happened. The real story might be what happens next. Because if the pattern Maddow described continues to unfold the way she suggested, we may be witnessing the early stages of a much larger political maneuver, a maneuver designed to shape the environment of American politics months before the next critical turning point. But here's the part that makes this entire situation so fascinating. Even if the strategy exists, it only works if the public continues paying attention to the narrative surrounding it. In other words, attention itself becomes a form of power, and that's exactly why moments like this broadcast can become so influential. Because once an idea enters the national conversation, it begins shaping how millions of people interpret the political events that follow. And that means the real impact of Maddow's revelation may not be measured today. It may be measured months from now, when the next major political moment arrives. For now, the debate continues. Supporters say the claims are exaggerated, critics believe the warning should be taken seriously, and analysts across the political spectrum are watching closely to see whether future developments confirm or challenge the theory Maddow presented. But one thing is already clear. The broadcast has changed the conversation. It has introduced a new question into the political landscape, a question that millions of Americans are now asking. Was this simply a dramatic television moment, or did the country just receive a glimpse of a political strategy that is only beginning to unfold? And if that strategy is real, the next few months in American politics could become far more unpredictable than anyone expected. Because sometimes the most important political battles aren't fought behind closed doors, they're fought in the arena of public perception, and the outcome of that battle may determine the direction of the entire political landscape.